Tom, thank you very much for joining us and traveling in.
Sure.
Josh, I'll let you take it away.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Drew, and thank you all for coming out. Hopefully a good day so far. Everyone's been enjoying. And yeah, we were excited to come to Boston. I spent 15 years here, now down in New York. As Drew mentioned, I run Clara Media, which is a small media holding company that owns CDX. And excited to be here with it's funny, Drew calls him Tom. I've known him for 14 years, always as Thomas. So with Thomas MacMillan, who's the CIO of Emblem Health. For those unfamiliar with Emblem Health, when you give a little background, it's a combination of 4 discrete entities.
Yep.
Talk a little about what it is, as well as that process as a CIO of taking 4 discrete entities and smacking them all together.
Yeah, so and thanks for the opportunity to come and share our story a little bit. So when most of you guys hear LaGuardia, you think of interminable delays and construction, which is what we have when we live in New York. But actually, Fiorello LaGuardia in the early 40s actually created our health plan. It was originally a health insurance plan in New York. And over 80 years, we've lived in New York and serviced New Yorkers. It's 4 different companies. It was an HMO company, a PPO company, a Connecticut-based insurer. We, in the early 2000s, acquired a medical practice that's about 500 physicians across the downstate New York area. And just 3 years ago, we launched a 4th entity of the insurance. We look at the 2 state insurances. We look at the provider business. We launched a digital health and wellness company called WellSpark. So they all wrap up under Emblem Health. We're about $8 billion entity. We cover about 3.1 million members in New York, Connecticut, and a tiny little section of Rhode Island and Massachusetts. So
it's interesting when you think about being both a payer and a provider. We've done a lot of work with Kaiser Permanente in California, and one of the things we learned was alignment of incentives. The payer and provider aren't always aligned, but when you bring them together, the outcomes are let's keep people healthier.
Right.
Versus looking at how the money moves, how the money flows. Talk a little about sort of when you sit on all this data and when you think about healthy patient outcomes or consumer outcomes, how that allows you to operate differently than if you just were operating as a payer.
Yeah, so it's health plans actually have a lot more data than the providers do. Your provider is a place you go once every so often when you get sick. So when you're a payer and a provider, I think it opens your eyes to where the friction points are between the two, because our provider business has patients who are not Emblem Health insured. And then our Emblem Health business obviously has membership who doesn't go to our provider business. But it gives us this cool little innovation laboratory to figure out how to make those 2 entities work together. We use the 2 today to figure out how do we close care gaps, how do we get engagement. One of the primary things that we've figured out is, if I polled the room and said, who in here trusts your insurance provider more than you trust your doctor? It's going to be a pretty lopsided, straw poll, right? So we've got to figure out ways to incent the providers to be the trusted health and wellness guide for the members. So when you own the provider side of the business, you get the luxury of saying to that provider side, hey, here's the whole view of Tom MacMillan, right? Here's all of their claims, all their medical, and here's how we're going to go engage. And this is one of, I think, the bigger challenges between the 2 is, the provider side is largely a pay-for-play or a fee-for-service kind of model. They want volume, they want high rates, and only when you get into trust-based payer and provider partnerships where you say, look, I'm going to do everything in my power to give you guys the data you don't have on that person, and you're going to do everything in your power to really help keep them well. And if we can figure out a way to get into partnership, so you look at a Kaiser or Geisinger or some of these larger payer providers, that trust is inherent because they're the same company. And so what we're trying to do is use technology and use that innovation of our own 2 entities to go and say to large providers that are not part of our insurance business, they say, look, I've done this with my own team, my own members and my own providers, we can do it with you. We are an Epic client, so for those in the provider space, Epic's the gorilla in the room. It gives us a ton of credibility because we can actually go and physically show folks how we do it. So it's a cool laboratory more than anything else, I think.
So when you think about that sort of data interoperability, right? First, you had to take these 4 organizations and figure out how to move data across them. You moved onto a single platform, or you've been spending the last couple of years moving those 4 onto a single platform. But how do you start thinking about then that data interoperability with, to your point, working with other payers or other providers? How is that process going? Sort of what have you learned?
So I've learned that consolidating and moving to one platform or another for the sake of doing it is not going to fly. So we've learned that the reason why is what matters. So from consolidation, hey, it's a great way to consolidate companies and actually operate in a single model. But more than anything else, for us, it's the value of getting that whole family of companies into one data universe that we can data mine and we can figure out how to run the business better. It also lets us really engender some of that trust with the provider community to say, hey, we're able to actually see all of the interactions around a particular human, and we don't just show you a slice of the pie because on our side of the fence we're really operating like 3 companies behind the scenes. So the why for us has been to be able to operate like a single entity. We focused a ton on data. We focused a ton on data mining. We focused a ton on predictive analytics so that we can now take what used to be data universes this big that are now this big, even augment them with second and third party data, and really start to produce insights. That's where we get the value both for how to get the member to feel like we're actually advocating for not just their sick care, but their wellness, and to go to the provider community and say, hey, we have a valuable asset that's much beyond what you're going to have from a hospitalization or something like that.
So when you think about, we just heard in the last session said that AI hadn't been mentioned a lot, in the morning. When you talk about predictive analytics, so obviously you have all this data you're sitting on, you're able to glean insights from it and make the data actionable. Mm-hmm. When you think about that as a CIO, are you building those applications yourself? Are you buying? Are you partnering? What is the strategy is as you sit on this data and think about how to make it actionable? Where are you investing, sort of in that next level of technology?
Yeah, so I would say if I had to do it like a pie chart, probably 70% of it is partner, buy, integrate. At our core, we're not an advanced data science and machine learning outfit. That's not where we generate our revenue from. That's not something that we have to own and be great at. There are companies that do that much better than us. But it's about knowing where to bring that in, right? So, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. We are trying to make sure that we are incremental and we can use on the payer side or the provider side that we prove out those machine learning kind of algorithms or partnerships so that we can say, okay, that's solid enough where we can, as was said earlier, talking about how to get information and a pile of data into so what. I call that in our shop, we call it conclusionary analytics. So great, here's a pile of data. What's the conclusion? So we try to use AI and ML to create conclusions that are like a pyramid that we can build on. But absolutely, we are an ecosystem partner. One of our other big investment areas is trying to create kind of digital ecosystems where we can try and buy a lot of those predictive analytics or AI algorithms or partner with a company for 6 months. And if it doesn't work out, we haven't overly sunk a bunch of costs into making somebody's product work. We're very kind of plug-and-play environment from a technology perspective.
And I'm assuming the migration to cloud, and platforms that do have APIs allow you to be much more nimble in testing some of those applications?
Yeah, 100%. Like I would say, if you look at the health payer industry and to some extent provider, which is tied up in about 2 or 3 large vendors, cloud for the sake of cloud is good. It's an administrative saving. It's a service model enhancement. What we've really found is it's as much about cloud or hybrid cloud as it is about the tooling and the platforms you choose. So we use Epic, as I mentioned. We're a big Salesforce client. Those are great tools because there's huge interoperability exchanges that you're not hemmed in whether you make a cloud or hybrid cloud solution decision. That said, we're trying to move as much of our workload to public cloud as we possibly can, where it's fit for purpose. What we can't push to there, we're pushing to a hybrid privatized cloud because it gives us a lot more ownership and flexibility. Public cloud is great for certain applications that are native for cloud. Right. You'd be surprised at the number of health payers still running lovely old IBM mainframes that don't really run that well in the cloud, certainly not in Google or anything.
Yeah, certain industries, I think the airline industry is still heavily mainframe.
Yes.
They're still manufacturing parts to support those. Yeah. And I do want, throughout, if there are any questions, please raise your hand. We don't have to wait for questions, to the very end. So, in the room, you obviously have I'll say the entrenched incumbents that represent some of the industries, and then you also do have the disruptors and the startups. If you were thinking about starting your business from scratch, right? So not inheriting
Our
these
health payer business, not my business.
Right.
Okay.
What are the advantages or disadvantages that an earlier stage company has coming in that doesn't inherit these legacy systems that they need to figure out how to work together? If you had the flexibility of really starting your tech stack from scratch, sort of where would you see sort of the benefit there?
Yeah, so I think I'd say virtually every startup company now is probably SaaS-based and is probably using some composable-based architecture, right? That lets them develop new functionality more nimbly and lets them integrate those features and functions into different go-to-market strategies. What we find in our industry and probably airlines and some of the others is there's very built-for-purpose technologies. Here you go, this is what this product does. And then we spend a ton of time trying to figure out how to make it talk to another product that's supposed to do a particular task. I look at health payers largely as an orchestrator. We make sure that this person pays a bill to us, and then we make sure that when they go to the doctor's claim gets paid by the money that the person, it's an orchestration job. So flexible platforms, cloud native, with data at the center of why we procure them, and the ability to move that data quickly source to source. So the talk from the ONC, Argentieri, that's a huge one for us, that while ONC standards are helping us, what we are finding is commercially just general API standards that we can adapt. If I was starting a company from the ground up, it's all about the intersection of having a really robust orchestration layer and a really robust data layer. Most of the processing applications, there's one out there that you could procure as a SaaS product, but if you can move that and orchestrate that data amongst SaaS products through some sort of a composable architecture, that's where I would restart us, right?
And a lot of the, Ritesh, you have a question.
So to that point, is the best solution for health systems hybrid cloud with open API sandboxes for it? Is that where you see it going?
I think it depends. I think if you're in the space of saying folks that want to get into being a service provider or a health tech or whatever as part of it, I think that is the way to go. Mostly because it makes the, again, acquisition and usage of those services much more easy. It's a different question when you start saying, how do you retrofit a plan toward that model? Because again, we're probably not going to get rid of our current claim platform. It's just too much to start over from scratch. But how do we wrap that in a layer that's all about integrating with startups and such?
So the role of a CIO, right? I mean, there's a lot of companies, right? I'll say interchangeably use CTO, CIO, CDO. A lot of the things we've talked about so far are enterprise level applications, but I'd love to understand your time spent when you talk about digital wellness platform, right? Which is something that's much more consumer facing, I'm assuming. How do you think about your role as managing both the enterprise side of all the infrastructure as well as the consumer facing applications and how consumers interact with your various platforms?
Yeah, so I'll say at my place, and probably some of the more recent literature would suggest it, that CIOs or CTOs, I'll probably leave chief data officers or innovation officers off the side, but CTO, CIO is more becoming a business architect. It's how to like advise the company to use technology to meet a business goal. So when we think about digital wellness and go to market for that, right? It's a patient facing, it's a consumer facing. We sell nationally to non-insured business with our wellness company. So in that mindset, the CIO's role is, how do we execute the go-to-market plan? How do we quickly, cheaply, nimbly build the technology to make a wellness platform? And then on the other days, the CIO role is how we're driving the enterprise in terms of business goal accomplishment. I do have a chief technology officer that sits beneath me inside the organization that focuses on some of those cloud types of things that I think has freed me up to think more on the business side of things. But I will say from a chief data officer perspective, that stock is rising, right? I think organizations at the C-suite level need to make an investment in having somebody whose sole focus is the data, whether it's monetizing it or creating insights out of it, that ultimately, again, you're not doing it to publish a peer-reviewed article in some cases. When it's in a commercial setting, it's there to drive the business outcomes. So a big role.
And do you see that role as it interacts with the CEO, the COO over the past decade has radically changed? Do you feel that the CIO now does have a seat at the table looking at business strategy and versus being told, here's our business strategy, you figure out what technology needs to be built to support it?
Right. Yeah. No, I think it's gone from watching the blinking lights and making sure that everything is going well and that you're executing well, towards, hey, how could we do this? How could we accomplish this? Or how can we enter this market? What products can we integrate with? Build buy decisions, which are huge monetary issues, are left to me and our organization a lot. So I think we've absolutely shifted the role towards more of a C-suite seat at the table on strategy. The other thing I guess I will share in my experience over the last 2.5 years with COVID, I think we went from a situation, at least in our world at health payer, where all of us were executing within some version of our multi-year strategy. We knew what we were doing. There was a set of railroad tracks out. And then everybody stops going to the doctor. And then everybody has to work from home. And then the notion of all the health tech startups that enable virtual visits and other models of care instead of going to the doctor's office start cropping up. And it comes back to, well, I got to jump on that. So I think in the last couple of years, I've felt a lot also like an advisor of how we adapt the business to the kind of new ecosystem out there, and partnering with the provider side a lot. I try not to forget that we have a provider business that, in March of 2020, we went from 50 virtual visits a day to 10,000 a week.
Oh, wow.
And so you all of a sudden you forget what you were working on and say, I have to go deal with this. So it's really a nimble position, I think.
And when you think about that data and that holistic view of the consumer, there's more and more inputs. There's people here that are creating discrete applications that should be fed in that the provider should be able to look at. What's the advice you're giving to either startups or new vendors that are coming in and saying, hey, we want to be a data source, we want to be an input into your patient records? How are you working with the various ecosystems?
So some recommendations and advice. One would be, we're glad you're there, right? We don't always have the answers to all that. The second recommendation would be package the integration. You have to think about the end user's workflow, especially in the clinical space. Doctors hate going from one pane of glass to another to have to stitch together what their next decision is. You got to integrate it in front of them in real time. We found that in our provider practice. And the last is, it's crucial to be as hyper-personalized as you can. I think in health particularly, you hear things like evidence-based medicine, health plans, insurers typically don't worry about personalization. I was telling somebody last night, insurance company is what you think of when you back your car into a lamppost and you have to file a claim. We have to shift health insurance to being a relationship that's about your wellness 365 days a year, or maybe 364. Then you go to the doctor that one day, yeah, we'll pay your claim. But what are we doing with you the other 364 days a year? Because if we don't have any relationship with the person, and the relationship is not personalized because there's none of that data coming to the doctor or to the insurance company or to a behavioral health entity or a care management entity, people don't like to engage. And when they don't engage, you don't really have a strong relationship, right? So we want to create lifetime value for the customers.
Right. Great. Well, Thomas, thank you for joining us. So let's give Thomas a round of applause.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.